The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence will come to order. Without objection, the subcommittee may recess at any time. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from a non-governmental panel of expert witnesses to examine the wide-ranging operations of transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, which have expanded both in size and sophistication, as well as to explore federal and other efforts to mitigate and disrupt TCO activities. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence. Today we are holding an important hearing on the menacing threat posed by transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, to our homeland security and public safety. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for your time and for testifying today. TCOs are groups or networks of individuals who engage in illegal activities across national borders. They engage in multifaceted criminal enterprise from drug trafficking to human trafficking to human smuggling and other criminal acts. Organized crime is a massive business. In fact, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. TCOs are responsible for trafficking deadly drugs like illicit fentanyl and other opioids into American communities, fueling violence and corruption and undermining the rule of law. These enterprises exploit our porous southern border to advance their criminal agendas as they facilitate and profit off of smuggling and trafficking of people, often victimizing susceptible migrants who are traveling along the treacherous journey from Central and South America to the United States. According to the DEA, Mexican TCOs in particular control smuggling corridors, mainly across the southwest border, and maintain the greatest drug trafficking influence in the U.S. The trafficking of drugs like illicit fentanyl into American neighborhoods and communities from Texas to New York by TCOs have contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. In fact, fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 to 45, and these deaths are occurring in every single state in our nation, unfortunately. The scourge of fentanyl has hit every single one of our communities. In February, 2 of my constituents lost their son, Jackson Lee Warnig, 17 years old, to fentanyl poisoning. Jackson's parents had to live through a nightmare that no parent should ever have to endure. Jackson's family has been working tirelessly across the Permian Basin to share their son's story to help educate other people on the dangers posed by synthetic opioids. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 107,735 Americans died between August 2021 and August 2022 from drug overdoses or from the poisoning of fentanyl, with the vast majority of those deaths involving synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Just this past April, the head of the DEA, Ann Milgram, called the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel the greatest criminal drug threat to the United States has ever faced, and that these ruthless, violent criminal organizations have associates, facilitators, and brokers in all 50 states in the United States, as well as in more than 40 countries around the world. These cartels purchase precursor chemicals from China, which are shipped to South America and Mexico, and using those precursors to produce fentanyl and even process that fentanyl into counterfeit prescription pills. The cartels then traffic the drugs from Mexico into the United States for distribution. To put this in perspective, and as noted recently by the DEA administrator, it costs the cartels as little as 10 cents to produce a fentanyl-laced fake prescription pill that is then sold in the United States for as much as $10 to $30. As a result, the cartels make billions of dollars from trafficking fentanyl into the United States each year. Cartels are also beginning to mix fentanyl with xylazine, a powerful sedative that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has permitted for veterinary use, has illicit uses, but it causes fatal overdoses in this country. It's also important to examine the collaboration between Asian and Mexican TCOs. In particular, the Asian TCOs play a major role in the laundering of illicit drug proceeds on behalf of Mexican TCOs. Meanwhile, China has ceased all Homeland Security investigations, or HSI, initiated over 1,300 criminal investigations related to sex trafficking and forced labor, resulting in more than 3,650 arrests and 630 convictions. We cannot allow these criminal networks to operate with impunity and endanger our homeland security and public safety. We must explore all tools at our disposal to detect, disrupt, and dismantle their operations and hold them accountable for their actions. As we face a growing crisis at the border, and as TCOs evolve, both in size and sophistication, it is more important than ever that we unequivocally support our dedicated Border Patrol, Homeland Security investigation agents, as well as our state and local law enforcement as they work on the front lines to disrupt and dismantle the egregious operations of the TCOs. This afternoon, I'm pleased to say that we have a distinguished panel of expert witnesses to discuss the TCOs, the grave threat that they pose to our homeland, and to have a debate in front of the American public on the direction that we should go as a whole of government in order to put a stop to this scourge that is causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us this afternoon, and I look forward to this discussion on a critical topic. And I'd now like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Magaziner, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing on such an important topic, and to our witnesses for being here today and for your work and your expertise. I am glad that we are having this hearing to examine threats posed by transnational criminal organizations to the U.S. homeland. TCOs are broad-ranging, originate all over the globe, and engage in many forms of criminal activity, from drug and arms trafficking to human smuggling to cybercrime and illegal fishing and mining. And in carrying out criminal activity, TCOs are often violent, degrading the security and stability of the countries they have a presence in, harming and killing civilians of those countries, and threatening the national security of the United States. In our neighboring country of Mexico and in Central and South America, violent crime has steadily been on the rise at the hands of drug trafficking organizations. It has been estimated that between 40 and 65% of all homicides in Mexico are organized crime related, and it is possible that the percentage is higher, as it is well known that the cartels have threatened journalists and government officials in attempts to cover up the identities of homicide victims. Mexican citizens are unfortunately not alone in living in fear of extreme violence under TCOs. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have some of the highest homicide rates in the world, and women and girls are disproportionately affected by TCO violence. In response, Central Americans and Mexicans flee their homes to avoid the threat of violence and often travel to the U.S. border for safety. More than 2 million people are estimated to have left El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras from 2014 through 2022. Many, hoping to escape the violence in their home countries, end up facing danger and extortion from TCOs on their journey. TCOs are connected to migrant smugglers who will charge a fee before allowing the smugglers and migrants to pass through territories under their control. Streamlining asylum processing and allowing migrants to apply for legal protection before they get to our border is a smart policy that is good for our national security because it undermines the financial model of human traffickers and creates more order at our border and points of entry. I am encouraged that the administration is exploring these policies so that those who are eligible for legal asylum don't have to make the dangerous journey under the extortion of smugglers, and those who are not eligible can find out because, as we all know, the cartels and the smugglers, the traffickers will tell people anything in order to convince them that if they do come to the United States, they'll have no problem getting in, even when that's not true. So by creating these opportunities, we can undercut the cartel's ability to exploit, traffic, and profit from vulnerable people. It is also critical that the United States collaborate with our partners in Mexico and Central America to stop the primary harm from TCOs to the U.S. homeland, illicit drug trafficking. Mexican drug traffickers are the primary wholesalers of U.S.-bound cocaine from the major supply countries of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and are also largely responsible for the procurement of fentanyl precursors from China and control the cross-border trafficking of fentanyl, a drug DEA Administrator Ann Milgram has declared the single deadliest drug threat our nation has ever encountered. As we hold today's hearing, we also need to focus on another source of the cartel's strength, the illegal export of guns from the United States across our southern border. ATF estimates that as many as 597,000 firearms are trafficked from the United States into Mexico each year. 597,000 each year. It is shameful, and it is fueling the cartel's violence, which only exacerbates the problems we face here at home. We cannot call ourselves fully committed to the fight against threats posed by transnational crime groups, particularly those operating in Mexico and Central America, until we act on illegal gun trafficking. So my hope for today's hearing, in addition to objectively examining the TCO threat landscape, is that we begin a discussion on how we in Congress can support the U.S. government's efforts to stifle cartel and all TCO activity. It is critical that we examine the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security, which through several components, including Homeland Security Investigations and the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, develop intelligence, interdict illicit money and goods, and investigate the TCOs. We must ensure that DHS has the resources and the authorities it needs to protect Americans from TCO violence. With that, once again, I thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Magaziner. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic, and I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Douglas Farah is the founder and president of IBI Consultants, a security consulting firm that specializes in field research studying security challenges and transnational organized crime in Latin America. From September 2013 to September 2022, Mr. Farah was a visiting senior fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University, where he led the Western Hemisphere Illicit Network Review Project under the auspices of Deputy Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. In that position, Mr. Farah briefed his research findings across the interagency and intelligence communities, including U.S. Southern Command. Farah also testified before Congress more than a dozen times on important matters related to Western Hemisphere and U.S. Homeland. Thank you. Mr. Christopher Urban is a former Assistant Special Agent in charge of U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA. Currently, he is the Managing Director at Nardello & Company, in which Mr. Urban supports the firm's efforts to target organized crime groups operating in the ports and borders of the United States, Mexico, Panama, and Colombia. Mr. Urban started his career with DEA in 1996 as a special agent in the New York division. He was later assigned to the New Jersey division, where he worked on several high-profile investigations involving Colombian and Mexican drug cartels. Mr. Urban also served on 2 overseas tours in Europe, working with international law enforcement agencies. Mr. Urban's most recent position was Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Special Operations Division for Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East. In particular, Mr. Urban has led sensitive global undercover DEA operations that targeted Chinese organized crime groups that facilitated money laundering for Mexican drug cartels. Thank you for being with us. Ms. Melissa Ford is the Policy Director for the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Secure and Sovereign Texas campaign, which helps to keep our country safe and free. Ms. Ford's work is focused on policies that secure the border and restore the rule of law. Prior to joining the foundation, Ms. Ford served as at the White House, first in the Office of American Innovation and later in the Domestic Policy Council. Ms. Ford has written extensively about foreign policy, public safety, drug cartels, and organized crime. Thank you for being with us. And lastly, Mr. Jason Blazakis is a professor at Middlebury Institute of Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where he focuses on threat financing, sanctions, and violent extremism and special operations related research. He is the director of the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism, where he directs research on domestic terrorism, terrorism finance, recruitment, propaganda, and the use of special operations to counter transnational threats. From 2008 to 18, he served as the Director of Counterterrorism Finance and Designations Office, Bureau of Counterterrorism, U.S. Department of State. We'd like to welcome all of our witnesses and thank you for your professional experience. I know that you have submitted statements for the record. Some of those will exceed 5 minutes. In the interest of time, please summarize your statements to 5 minutes so that we can go along the committee lines here and ask questions. I now recognize Mr. Douglas Farah for your 5 minutes and an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger and Ranking Member Magaziner and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the issue of transnational criminal organizations and the threats they pose to the homeland. The multi-billion-dollar illicit economies in Latin America, centered on the cocaine trade but diversifying to new commodities and activities, are undergoing profound restructuring with long-term strategic repercussions for the United States and its allies in the hemisphere. New actors, new markets, and new products are driving fragmentation among traditional groups, consolidation of criminalized economies, and convergence among different actors that are driving instability and corruption. The growing ideologically agnostic criminalized authoritarian model is spreading across Latin America, with leaders staying in power through alliances with transnational criminal structures that render ideology almost meaningless. While the world of illicit economies and TCO structures are undergoing a seismic realignment across the hemisphere, many of our strategies to combat these threats remain rooted in the past. Much of the law enforcement and intelligence community analysis do not grasp the significant implications of state and governments that actively seek the participation of TCOs as part of their national strategic endeavors, often relying on old paradigms of ideologically driven actors, monoproduct cartel structures, and shared values of once friendly governments. Yet, as General Richardson, the commander of U.S. Southcom, recently stated, the Western Hemisphere is under assault from, quote, a host of cross-cutting transboundary challenges that directly threaten the homeland. Already, the staunch anti-U.S. bloc of countries led by Venezuela is ensconced in power, while deeply corrupt authoritarian governments in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are no longer viable partners for the United States. In Colombia, which has been the strongest partner of the United States for the past 3 decades, President Gustavo Petro campaigned on moving away from that alliance, and since taking office has consistently bolstered the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Most of Colombia's counter-narcotics efforts have been brought to a standstill by budget cuts, loss of experienced personnel, and a lack of political will. This leaves us with the very real possibility that the traditionally robust alliance of U.S. strategic partners in Latin America will be reduced to a handful of the smallest countries rather than regional economic and political leaders. Amid these changes, new actors such as Albanian organized crime, Turkish criminal groups, Libyan fixer groups, and Italian mafia groups are emerging as significant new players across the region, changing the dynamics of the traditional criminal economics and offering new paths to expand profits through product and market diversification. I and my colleagues at the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies in a spring 2023 policy brief identified several emerging threats that we believe need to be dealt with quickly. The first is the trafficking of natural resources, especially gold, that is a primary contributor to massive environmental degradation, health hazards, child labor, human trafficking, sexual slavery, and loss of state legitimacy. It also opens broad new avenues of almost untraceable money laundering that's being taken advantage of by criminalized states and criminal groups. The second is the diversification and expansion of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Jalisco, in the past 3 years, has emerged as the most prominent cocaine trafficking organization in Latin America and is expanding its operation and corruptive influence in different parts of the world. A primary area of expansion is into the diversified economic portfolio of growing fake and counterfeit pharmaceuticals, a new multi-billion-dollar industry, as well as the fentanyl industry mentioned by the chairman and the ranking member. The second is the evolution of the MS-13 and the PCC gangs into transnational criminal organizations. Since the 1990s, the MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha in Central America, and the PCC in Brazil have been identified primarily as street thugs known for their ruthless violence, flashy tattoos, neighborhood extortion rings, and cultural insularity. These groups have now moved far beyond being that type of gang and are what we have termed in the academic community, community-embedded transnational armed groups. working in informal and imperfect alliances to become part of the multinational trafficking structures that are effectively challenging U.S. strategic interests in the region and make the U.S. ability to respond to the broadening instability much more difficult. The third one that we identified is the emergence of new extra-regional criminal structures. As noted with the diversification of markets and products, the face of transnational organized crime in Latin America is growing much more diverse. Now there is a growing presence of Eastern European, Chinese, Turkish, Italian, Balkan syndicates, all vying for space across the transnational criminal world in the hemisphere, and this is most visible in the crisis in Ecuador. In conclusion, as illicit networks expand their territorial control, ecosystems of corruption, and political power, they are aided and abetted by extra-regional actors such as China, Russia, and Iran, who undercut the rule of law and directly challenge U.S. goals and initiatives across the hemisphere. As traditional transnational organized criminal groups form new alliances with non-state extra-regional networks and merge with regional criminal state actors, the United States is very likely facing an unprecedented loss of key allies and influence in the hemisphere. The United States has an underutilized toolbox that can be deployed to reverse these worrisome trends, but new policy initiatives backed by resources to carry them out must be deployed quickly, or the cost of these trends will be even higher. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Farah. I now recognize Mr. Urban for your opening statement.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important issue. I spent 24 years working for the DEA, where I worked as an agent as well as a supervisor to investigate and disrupt and dismantle significant transnational organized crime within the United States and around the world. During the last several years of my career with DEA, I worked in DEA's Special Operations Division, SOD, with an interagency group to target what we identified as a growing threat: the collaboration between Chinese and Mexican TCOs in the trafficking of fentanyl and in the money laundering activities associated with it. It's a development that I and others at SOD dedicated substantial efforts to understanding and addressing. And this may be relevant to the subcommittee's consideration as it seeks to address threats to the homeland posed by these TCOs. To understand how this collaboration works, it's important to understand how it developed in the past. Mexican cartels, including Sinaloa and CJNG, have long established control over territory in Mexico and access to supply and distribution chains extending into the United States. This dates from their trafficking time in cocaine and heroin and other drugs that are produced south of the U.S. border and moved into the United States for sale. The cartels used that control and access to move into the fentanyl marketplace as the source of supply for these deadly drugs. They became available primarily via precursor chemicals supplied by Chinese TCOs. This development presents an unprecedented challenge by itself. But there's another part of this growing relationship that helps fuel the success of fentanyl production and distribution: the growing role of Chinese organized crime that they have taken in the laundering of drug proceeds. The Mexican cartels, they launder these proceeds for the Mexican cartels in a way that's safer, quicker, and more profitable for the cartels. As reflected by the graphic in Exhibit 1 to my testimony that you have, here is how it works. Every day in the United States, Chinese money brokers pick up narcotics proceeds from the sales of fentanyl and other drugs such as cocaine and heroin in the form of bulk U.S. cash. A distribution gang, let's say in New York or any other city in the United States that owes payment to the Mexican cartel, delivers the bulk cash to the Chinese broker in the United States. That Chinese broker then sells the U.S. dollars to Chinese customers who want to spend their money in the U.S. acquiring real estate, paying for college tuition, gambling, or other investments. These Chinese customers pay in China for the cash they receive in the U.S. It doesn't cross borders. The proceeds in China are used to buy goods for export to Mexico or South America, where the goods are sold by the Chinese brokers located in Mexico to recoup their funds. Some of the proceeds are also used to pay for precursor chemicals that enable the cartels to produce more synthetic opioids bound for the United States. These Chinese brokers accomplish all this with a trusted electronic encryption communications network that allows this to happen instantly. It's called WeChat. While the threat posed by the collaboration between Chinese and Mexican TCOs is real and growing, more can be done to combat it. More investigative resources, such as translators, data scientists, and experienced targeting analysts, will enable law enforcement to have the tools needed to detect and investigate these networks where they operate. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have authorized the imposition of sanctions for participants in the global trade of fentanyl and synthetic opioids. Recent sanctions on Chinese brokers of precursor chemicals and Mexican suppliers of synthetic opioids are an encouraging development, but further investments in the sanctions program along the lines of the effective sanctions program targeting those involved in the Russian aggression against the Ukraine would help address this threat. In the private sector, where I now work for Nardello & Co., the global investigative firm, I'm also seeing greater awareness by the business community that needs to understand this emerging threat and develop the tools to address it. More investments in training and detection will facilitate private sector's organizations' compliance with anti-money laundering laws and help protect the integrity of our financial system, as well as reduce the flow of dangerous synthetic opioids in the United States. Congress can also play a vital role by providing resources, incentives, and the authority for the government and the private sector to work together to combat this threat. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about this important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. I now recognize Mrs. Ford for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziners, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Melissa Ford Maldonado, and I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a nonprofit and nonpartisan research institute. We're based in Austin, Texas, but I'm originally from Bolivia. My work focuses on the relationship between the US and Mexico, and I've done extensive research on Mexican drug cartels and why they pose a huge threat to the US and Texas. What I've learned is that cartels have complete control over the southern side of the border that the US recently labeled the deadliest the border that the UN recently labeled the deadliest land crossing in the world. There are record numbers of people dying while attempting to cross in the worst conditions possible, and this is all being orchestrated by cartels. People who've lived and worked on the border for decades are saying that they've never seen tragedies of this magnitude. Officials in Eagle Pass are having to keep a refrigerated truck to hold the bodies of migrants that are drowning in the Rio Grande. And across the river in Piedras Negras, families often report seeing bodies floating under the bridge. Less than a year ago, a trailer with over 60 migrants locked inside was abandoned by a smuggler near San Antonio, and 53 of them died after being left in the heat. To cartels, these human beings are just commodities to be exploited and discarded. That's what cartels do. They prey on the vulnerable. Workers that aid migrants at the border estimate that most females encounter some sort of sexual assault on their way to the US. And they're also telling us that there's been a significant rise of sex trafficking cases involving children. But cartels won't stop. They're richer and they are bolder than ever, and they will continue to take advantage of our weak border to extend their operations into the US. The effect on Texans is just as heartbreaking. We've spoken to ranchers and homeowners who no longer feel safe in their homes, who can't walk around their property unarmed or let their children play outside because they've encountered armed smugglers on their land, breaking in, stealing, destroying their property, and many have had to move away because of this. Texas communities are also facing a growing number of high-speed car chases. In March, in Ozona, a 7-year-old girl named Amelia and her grandma were killed, along with 2 of the 11 migrants, due to a high-speed car chase that ended in a wreck. We're also seeing an increase in American teenagers being recruited on social media by cartels to transport migrants. We saw it with a 15-year-old in Mission, then a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old in San Antonio, and then with a 15-year-old in El Paso as well. And DPS there in El Paso, when we were there a few weeks ago, told us that this is a daily occurrence for them, and sometimes they see multiple of these high-speed car chases in just one day. And another problem we're having is these officers are increasingly assaulted. 248 Border Patrol agents have been assaulted just this fiscal year. This is all having a huge impact in the quality of life of communities in Texas, but it's not just a Texas problem. Our entire country is feeling the effects of the deadliest drug crisis in history. Texas alone has seized 418 million lethal doses of fentanyl since 2021. To put that into perspective, that's enough to kill every man, woman, and child in America. One of the most disturbing parts of this is that the cartels are processing deadly amounts of fentanyl into pills made to look like any other prescription pill, but they're laced with fentanyl. One mother, Rebecca, shared in testimony how both her sons, Kyler and Caleb, 18 and 20, were killed by pain pills that were laced with fentanyl. Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and members of the subcommittee, I believe that cartels are the largest threat to the U.S. right now. Texas is working really hard to fight them, but we need help. And this crisis is happening because the federal government has failed to do their job to secure the border and protect the people of Texas and the U.S. And I ask you to be realistic about what we're up against. We must face the fact that the border is already militarized from the southern side. Cartels control 30 to 40% of Mexico's territory right now, and there is extensive evidence of collusion between the state and the cartels. This is a new scenario that demands new solutions from policymakers like you, who need to understand that the Mexican state as a meaningful partner against cartels is a thing of the past. Therefore, I think we need to use every option on the table to fight back against them. Thank you for your time. I'm grateful for your leadership and ready to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ford. The chair now recognizes Mr. Blazakis for his opening statement of 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I request that my full written statement be put into the record. Since the beginning of the Trump administration, the U.S. national security architecture has pivoted to the challenge of tackling state-borne threats. While there is little question that Russia, China, and Iran pose significant threats to U.S. national security interests, we must not ignore the broad array of transnational actors that seek to harm the United States. This is why your hearing today is so important. It gives us a chance to examine the transnational threat landscape. Prior to joining the Middlebury Institute as a professor, I worked in the federal government for nearly 20 years. Of those years in government service, I worked across both Republican and Democratic administrations. While in government, I worked directly on counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, and intelligence issues. And these experiences of working in counterterrorism, law enforcement, and intelligence for the United States government really has influenced my views about which policy options are most suitable for countering terrorist groups and criminal organizations like drug cartels. Today, I was asked to focus my testimony on the question of whether or not the Mexican drug cartels should be designated as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs for short. It's also very important to emphasize that the question of whether to label the Mexican cartels as FTOs has come up before. In fact, President Trump said that he was going to designate the cartels, but he did not do so. Here are some of the reasons why I think designating the Mexican drug cartels as FTOs is a bad policy idea. And I'd also like to note in my written testimony, there are other reasons that I can't address in my oral. First, the FTO list is comprised of organizations that are guided by an ideological belief system. The Mexican drug cartels are guided by one thing, a desire to make money. They don't peddle drugs because they want to uproot the powers that be. They have no interest in governing. Simply put, unlike ISIS, they have no interest in creating a caliphate-like structure. They don't have an interest in overthrowing the Mexican government. Second, if the State Department starts designating criminal groups as terrorists, the number of eligible targets that could be added to the FTO list would increase significantly. Hundreds of new organizations would be added to the FTO list, not just the Mexican cartels. Many more would be eligible for listing. Brazilian gangs, Central American gangs, Italian mafia groups, the Yakuza crime syndicate, and many more. That's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for bureaucratic inertia, especially when you consider the amount of work that goes into every FTO designation. Each FTO designation takes hundreds, or in some cases, thousands of hours to complete. There is one significant advantage, though, to applying the FTO regime against Mexican drug cartels. Adding the Mexican cartels to the terrorist list would trigger the material support benefits that come with FTO designations. Simply put, that means more time behind bars for those who try to provide material support to the cartels. But on the other hand, there is a negative to this benefit. Now, I could easily imagine scenarios where drug consumers may run afoul of the material support clause when they buy drugs trafficked by a Mexican drug cartel. I provide a few examples of such hypothetical scenarios in my written testimony. Fourth, the designation of the Mexican drug cartels would damage U.S.-Mexico relations. If the U.S. government pushes the Mexican government on the FTO designation, it does run the risk that Mexico will distance itself from the United States and strengthen relations with countries like China and Russia. For these reasons, and for others mentioned in my written testimony, adding the Mexican drug cartels to the FTO list would do very little to solve this immense national security challenge. There are better alternatives that can meaningfully counter the cartels. First, the United States needs to look inwards. The Mexican drug cartels are well armed, and it has been well documented that the cartels are getting their guns from the United States. The U.S. should explore arms control options that diminish the cartels' access to weapons. Second, the U.S. should engage in capacity building to build up the Mexican financial sector, not just the governmental sector. Third, the State Department should make more cartel individuals subject to the narcotics rewards program. And fourth, we must treat the demand side of this problem. This means investing more in health and educational policies that can cut down America's insatiable appetite for drugs. Finally, we must not forget the challenge that is posed by groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Wagner Group, and Iran's threat network. These transnational actors pose a significant threat to the U.S. homeland. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blazakis, for your statement, for all the witnesses' statements. Members will now be recognized by order of seniority for 5 minutes of questioning, and an additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Hearing the discussion, the first thing that I will address is that there's this narrative that seems to be that the problem is in the United States and not with the lack of rule of law at our border and to the south. And so immediately I would like to push back on that suggestion that the rule of law and the lack of rule of law as we see it is directly responsible for this. I'll start with Mr. Urban. In April, you testified before the House Oversight Committee and Accountability Committee. In your testimony, you discussed how Chinese organized crime networks launder money for Mexican transnational criminal organizations. You stated that more needs to be done. What steps can the U.S. take to undercut this budding relationship between the Chinese organized crime networks and Mexican TCOs?
So it's twofold. One is certainly on the government law enforcement side. There's an opportunity to leverage data that's judicially acquired by law enforcement. One component or an access point or a weakness of Chinese organized crime is that you can pull that data in and map the network out, identify the targets that the government should go after in terms of prosecution. So that's on the government side. Also on the government side, we've used the term whole of government approach in the past. What I mean by that is using specific authorities that the government has that we can leverage to impact the Chinese money laundering network. For example, sanctions. For example, pulling visas of identified Chinese money launderers that we decide we're not going to prosecute. There's a limited amount of resources to prosecute high-value targets and leadership. So that's on the government side. On the private sector side, I think training, enhanced compliance at banks, financial institutions, wire remitters. This is an evolving threat, so I think there needs to be essentially a partnership to some degree with government and the private sector where we provide the intelligence, not sensitive intelligence, but the information that will allow them to enhance their compliance programs to impose what I call costs on Chinese money launderers, make it more difficult for them, whether again through government arrests and prosecutions or on the private sector side with compliance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Urban. And I'm hearing that strength works best when dealing with these thugs. And Ms. Ford, I'll go to you. This narrative that illegal immigration from some of my counterparts on the other side of the aisle has absolutely nothing to do, the wide open porous borders has nothing to do with the rise of transnational criminal organizations, the trafficking of drugs, the trafficking of people. You mentioned the 53 tragic deaths in the tractor trailer south of San Antonio. What is illegal immigration and the surge, over 5 million since Biden took office, doing to allow the flow of drugs and trafficking of people into this country?
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger. A lot of people do say that the problem with legal immigration is sometimes we use the cartels as a guise to go after illegal immigration, right? But I would say two things about that. The problem is not about immigration. This is about border security and national security. And I also think that if people care about migrants, they should realize that the most inhumane thing that we can do to them is let things run the course that they're continuing to run. They're being smuggled, they're being abused, they are often being killed at the border. So we need to crack down on the border and crack down on the people that are taking advantage of them if we want to do something about illegal immigration. Now, I also think that illegal immigration is posing a threat to what's happening, because we're seeing numbers come in like they've never come in before. And we're seeing so much insecurity at the border, and that's taking away a lot of limited resources and attention that should be going towards protecting the homeland.
Thank you very much. Mr. Farah, the evidence that links the Sinaloa cartel and Hezbollah has been well documented by the DOJ through arrests and indictments, and the relationship between the two organizations has fueled instability between Latin America and the Middle East for the last decade. Can you describe that relationship to us today?
The Mexican cartels and Hezbollah have primarily a financial relationship that allows them to move money to designated terrorist organizations in the Middle East in exchange for access to ports and the import of illegal products or smuggled products or products that don't counterfeit products into our hemisphere. I think my work is primarily focused on the tri-border area of Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, where you see this network of now PSC, which is the main gang, with Hezbollah operatives and with Colombian and Mexican drug cartels moving into ever-expanding circles of collaboration, not out of ideology or religion, but simply for the ability to profit. And when I talked about the new groups that are emerging in the hemisphere, is this type of new specialization that comes in, this ability of Hezbollah to provide new things that the cartels didn't have before access to, new methodologies, et cetera. So I think that it's an economic relationship that is primarily going into different types of specialization, which is being harmful to the countries in place, as well as posing an increasing threat to the homeland.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, the ranking member, Mr. Magaziner, for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. The reality is that because these TCO threats emanate from outside our border, because the violence, the taking advantage of people who are fleeing poverty, fleeing persecution, all originates or primarily originates in Central, South America and beyond. We need to work with our foreign partners in order to crack down on TCO violence. We have to do that. And some of those countries that we must work with are more reliable partners than others. That is the case. It has always been the case. But if we are truly going to get to the root causes of these threats, it requires multilateral coordination. So on that theme, Mr. Blazakis, you talk about building capacity in our partner countries in your written testimony. Can you expand on what the opportunities are in working with Mexico and our South and Central American allies to crack down on TCO activity?
I would highlight one specific example from my written testimony. I highlighted the need for Mexico, for instance, to improve its Financial Action Task Force, or FATF rating, related to Recommendation 23, which focuses on designated non-financial businesses and professions, DNFBPs for short. This area is especially important in Mexico and is one of many countries, really, that have struggled with trying to strengthen the designated non-financial business and professional sector. And it's really important to build that up for a lot of reasons, especially in Mexico. When we're talking about DNFBPs, we're talking about lawyers, accountants, and many others in similar professions who are enabling transactions. The drug cartels can't wash their money in the way that Mr. Urban discussed really eloquently without having some kind of legitimate business or invest in real estate without having an army of enablers. These enablers are areas where the U.S. government should focus a lot of its capacity building moving forward, in addition to trying to build the capacity of prosecutors, especially in the area of corruption.
Thank you. On a related note, Mr. Farah, I was struck by a portion of your written testimony. You wrote, Russia and China view Latin America as a key theater of great power competition and act accordingly. The U.S. must forego complacency and seek creative new engagements with its partners. Higher quality, more comprehensive, and more sustained engagement with the right communities will go far to strengthen democracy, civil society, and regional stability. Can you expand on that a bit? And in so doing, what can we do? What can we, the United States, do to motivate our foreign partners to be better partners and more effective partners in tracking down on TCO activity?
Thank you. I think it's a challenging environment because we are now facing numerous governments that have, for example, the government of Argentina, which has declared itself as Russia's doorway to Latin America and has allowed China to come with nuclear programs, deep space stations, et cetera. So I think that there is more constrained space to operate with trusted partners. I think at the same time, the vast majority of folks in the military and in the law enforcement community prefer the United States as their first partner of choice. And I think that if you look at, and we mapped this out for Southcom and others over time, the level of high-level visits by the Russian and Chinese is about 17 times the level of U.S. visits to Latin America. And I think what I told them at the time, if Russia can find the time in the middle of a war to send its foreign minister around, we should be able to do a little better. We have a huge disadvantage with Russia in that they have a small cadre of highly experienced ambassadors that rotate around the region, speak Spanish, or on Twitter all the time. We have major embassies sitting without ambassadors for, in the case of Chile, almost 3 years. Now we're going into Colombia, we're going into the second year. So I think that there are multiple relatively easy fixes to that engagement. And I think we also need to do a better job of helping to explain the threats to their own democracies and rule of law that the Russian and Chinese involvement bring, because they're directly tied to massive corruption and massive destruction of their own institutions.
Thank you. And Mr. Blazakis, one final question. You know, there's a pattern that is developed at our hearings on the border where members of both parties talk about the importance of cracking down on human smuggling, cracking down on drug trafficking, but when it comes to trafficking guns, there's a often deafening silence on the other side of the aisle. Can you talk about why this aspect of TCO activity is so important and something that we need to address?
Just as you mentioned in your opening testimony, you know, there is the illegal export of nearly 600,000 weapons going into Mexico. That's not insignificant. In many ways, it could be perceived as fueling this insurgency that's happening in Mexico that's taken so many civilians' lives in Mexico that Ms. Maldonado mentioned, and also the lives of Americans when the drugs come back into the United States. So in this case, we have to improve our border security, going outbound, as just one example, and using technology, AI technology especially, could be one way to get at this challenge.
All right, my time has expired. Thank you all.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blazakis, is that how you say it, or Blazakis?
Potato, potato. My grandmother would say Blazakis, I say Blazakis.
Blazakis, thank you, sir. One point that you've made, it's interesting, as I listen to the witnesses, I think it sounds like a very tough nut to crack. And I understand this FTO designation thing has been out there for a while, and I hope I come to that with you, Mr. Blazakis. But I want to first get at the last thing Mr. Magaziner was referring to, and you have in your testimony, that the Senate says the report information from Mexican authorities. Whether they're reliable or not, I can't tell without further looking at it, but found that approximately 70-90% of guns found in criminal investigations are linked to the United States. Then your next sentence, this figure tells us that the availability and accessibility of guns within the United States renders their feasible illicit transfer. So I want to make sure I understand this. Are you saying that just the fact that we have broad Second Amendment rights and Americans have, I've got a Glock 19, is that we can't stop Mexican drug cartels because of that?
Oh, that's certainly one component of it. There's no questioning that there are illegal weapons illegally being moved, and individuals may be purchasing these weapons legally in the United States. So there is a significant access to weapons. There's no secret about that in the United States.
There certainly is access to guns in the United States. It's constitutionally protected. The question I have for you, what are you saying then should be done about that? I mean, I didn't think it was a great idea when the Obama administration ran guns in the United States. I remember that big controversy. I wasn't here then. So that seems dumb. I think if there are ways to stop trafficking guns across the border southward, I'm for that. But what beyond that are you saying? Do you think we just need to repeal the Second Amendment? I just want to understand what you're proposing.
No, not at all. Not the repeal of the Second Amendment, but I think careful consideration about who should have access to guns is particularly important, and what kinds of weapons should be accessible to the American public. I mean, we've seen time and again, this is a separate issue, school shootings in this country plaguing us, just as the drug epidemic is plaguing us. Access to AR-15s, automatic weapons, some of these things absolutely need to be explored and taken seriously. But in addition to that, as I mentioned before, the challenge of the border and these weapons going illegally across the border, there are things that you can do short of looking at arms control related gun laws in America that would be helpful. As I mentioned, to responding to Mr. Magaziner, the use of AI technology, bolstering our border officials' capabilities to look at what's going outbound. A lot of that requires intelligence as well. Who are going across the border bringing these weapons? And that's a thorny issue as well, constitutionally, in terms of the investigation of Americans here. So these are quite a few issues I would explore.
Okay, I hope I'll have a chance to come back to you. Mr. Urban, I was interested in looking at your model that was on the diagram in your testimony, and I found myself sort of surprised that with all the advances made, the suspicious activity reports that financial institutions do, and they do them by the ton, that the success we've had in interdicting terrorists moving money, that we actually, that this is really a model they can money launder, Chinese money brokers can money launder proceeds from illicit drug transactions in huge quantities in order to supply Chinese who want to exercise, use money in the United States. Why are we not having success in breaking that up? It's classic money laundering, isn't it?
It's the cash that's here that's bought by Chinese nationals after the Chinese broker receives the proceeds. It's disconnected from the financial system. So there's...
it does not go through the financial system?
It does, but it's disconnected in a way that it's not linear, where the drug proceeds are smurfed into banks or smuggled or wire transferred. The cash stays in each country or location. So it's not traditionally like it's been wired or moved or transferred. That's what you're talking about, suspicious activity reports. This is the dollars stay in the U.S., pesos stay in Mexico, and RMB stays in China.
I would think the source of that money in those accounts would be suspicious to a financial institution handling it. So that it may be something that requires deeper than here. I want to get one more question in, or what comment. It does seem to me, you mentioned WeChat though.
Yes.
And so you got that social media network. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal that comes out today. Instagram connects vast pedophile network. It's really, I didn't get a chance to read the entire article. It's really shocking. Ms. Ford Maldonado, you talked about, of course, child trafficking is a phenomenon that we see. Sex trafficking in the United States, facilitated by cartels, is something that we've seen that at higher levels than ever. Maybe I'll ask you, are social media networks contributing to that illegal conduct? I've been concerned about U.S. officials, agencies suppressing free speech on social media networks and have fought that, agencies doing that, but we ought to be doing everything we can to stop illegal conduct on Instagram that's promoting pedophilia and so forth, shouldn't we?
Gentleman's time has expired, but please quickly.
Yes, 100%. I think there's a lot of social media platforms that are very responsible for what's going on. And we've also done a lot of research on social media platforms being used to recruit people to take place in trafficking and smuggling and all of the illegal activities.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for being here today. I want to follow up on a line of questioning that my colleague, Mr. Bishop, was asking, because my experience as a prosecutor of transnational criminal organizations makes it pretty clear to me that these organizations need some mechanism to maintain their power and their authority. And Mr. Blazakis, when you were in your opening testimony, you talk a fair bit about that mechanism being assault weapons. And I believe you say, based on your research, which I've also seen, that approximately 70 to 90% of guns found by Mexican authorities during criminal investigations are linked back to the United States. Are you aware of how many legitimate gun stores there are in Mexico?
I'm unaware, no,
One.
it's very little.
One. So there are nearly 500,000 guns that go across the border from the United States to Mexico illegally, as you point out. And Mr. Urban, I'm grateful for your service in the DEA, with whom I worked with many of your colleagues. What impact do you think that the cartels having access to assault weapons and other weapons of war has on their ability to control the border, to control human smuggling, to control the opioid and fentanyl trade?
Well, certainly the access of weapons by the cartels, it's a paramilitary organization. Many of their former members are former members of the Mexican military, enables them to impose themselves in violence throughout the country and to determine how they want to smuggle drugs across the border. So the weapons obviously facilitate that.
Right, and without those, weapons of war to maintain that control at the border, is it your experience, or based on your experience, would you believe that the Mexican government, with support from the United States and other countries, would be able to curtail the authority and power of the cartels?
Is it concerns just weapons, or in general, a joint partnership or relationship to
Well,
target the
I'm
cartels?
trying to understand the impact of this influx of assault weapons from the United States to Mexico, especially to the cartels, how that impacts the Mexican government's ability to crack down on the cartels as well.
Sure, them being well armed makes it difficult to control them.
And would you say, and I'll turn to Ms. Ford Maldonado, the executive order signed by the president in 2021 lays out, Executive Order 14060 in December 2021 lays out objectives and mechanisms to fight these cartels and to fight the fentanyl trafficking. What's your sense of how that has been implemented and whether that has had a material impact on the cartels across the border?
I think, unfortunately, the situation that we're seeing at the border is only getting worse and worse. And so something new needs to happen, and we need to address the new problems that we're facing. And I believe that every option should be on the table to fight these cartels, because they're not a small threat anymore. I think they're the largest criminal threat to the United States right now. And I think we should have every option on the table. Right now, we have a very strong, robust military, and they're employed in different missions around the world, which is honestly necessary. But our governance is threatened because we're not using the full force and weight of the United States to protect our own border and fight those that are coming in and basically declaring war against Americans. And so we should be...
Well, I do think that, one of the things that we are talking about here, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, I'm about out of time, to the extent that my colleagues on the other side talk a lot about the control that the cartels have over the fentanyl trade, over human smuggling, we have to look at this outflow of American-made guns to the Mexican cartels, which give them the control at the border and the power to oversee these trafficking networks. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here this afternoon and sharing your time with us. Since the Biden administration has taken office, encounters at our southwest border have hit record numbers. The latest statistics of monthly border encounters on our southwest border show that the number of encounters is 10 times more than they were in 2020. To reach and cross our southwest border, illegal immigrants often rely on smugglers and cartels working for TCOs. The FAA recently signed off on plans to open a migrant shelter in a warehouse at JFK International Airport, just blocks from my congressional district. Ms. Ford Maldonado, what sort of risks are associated with housing unvetted migrants at a major international airport?
I can tell you that the problem is no longer just people coming in and looking for a better life. And I have a stat right here. In the last 26 months, we've seen 6 million total encounters from 171 different countries. And we've had 1.7 million total gotaways. So we don't even know what threat they're posing to our country. But I can tell you that it's not a victimless crime, right? The immigration that's going on. It's coming in, it's taking away from our resources that should be used to defend our country from all of these threats coming in. And in just the first 26 months of this administration, CBP has apprehended over 80,000 criminals at the border with the very few resources that are at the border right now. And what's especially scary about that is 90% of our border resources aren't even on the front lines. And so I think that among the 80,000 criminals, if you think about it, there were murderers, there were rapists, pedophiles, gang members. There's even a term, angel families, for all the people that have lost their sons, their daughters, their family members to crime coming in from illegal immigration because we don't have control over our borders. So I think it's a massive threat. I think we need to get it into control. I think we've handed complete operational control of the border to the cartels. And we have no idea what else is coming in.
Yeah, I agree. And, not only is it a failure of the administration, it's a failure of our Secretary of Homeland Security, it's a failure of the American people, but it's also a failure of those seeking the American dream. I've always said that I support people coming into this country, but coming through the front door. And nobody comes to this country for a better way of life because they want to be stored in a vacant building at JFK Airport. TCOs are decentralized and depend on multiple illicit businesses, support from adversarial and lawless nation states, and work together with other TCOs. Human traffickers use new technologies such as cryptocurrencies to hide and obscure payments while trafficking these humans coming across our southern border. The first question is, what techniques have law enforcement used to keep up with the evolving networks and techniques that are employed to traffic humans covertly? I'll leave that to anybody.
I'll take that question. I think the Department of Justice, federal investigators have done an excellent job charting the cryptocurrency flows, whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, you name the crypto. The government has worked with groups like Chainalysis in the private sector and CipherTrace, amongst others, to be able to track cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is not anonymous, it's pseudonymous. And there is a great capability that exists within the government to track crypto as a general matter. And we have seen billions of assets frozen of transnational groups who have thought that they were able to have secure transactions via crypto, and they've lost those forfeited funds to the United States. So we are doing some good work in the crypto space, with great technology being leveraged by the Department of Justice in conjunction with the law enforcement community and the private sector in this space.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate y'all being here. I'm going to start with Mr. Urban. Sir, why do you think the cartels purchase chemicals necessary for the production of fentanyl from China?
There's obviously a budding relationship there, and there's an ease to get them, as well as there's a tremendous amount of chemical companies in China that produce the precursors that they need.
That's a pretty long trip from China to Mexico, isn't it, sir? Doesn't that increase costs, shipment costs?
Sure, it certainly would increase shipping costs, but again, it's obvious that they are successful in acquiring the precursors from China, so they continue to do it.
Thank you. In a communist-run country like China, you would think that they would be able to crack down if they wanted to on the supply that's coming over and killing so many Americans. Would you agree with that? Or maybe do a better job of cracking down?
I believe they can, yes.
Sir, have you ever read the book Unrestricted Warfare?
I have.
What about anybody else on the panel? Mr. Farah, have you read Unrestricted Warfare? Ms. Maldonado? Sir, on the end? It was written and published in 1999, authored by 2 PLA senior colonels, and it talks about China's plan to, dominate and take out the United States of America using economic warfare, cyber warfare, elite capture, corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, asymmetric warfare on almost every aspect of our social, economic, and political life. Basically, take out the United States of America without firing a shot if possible. Does that sound familiar to anybody on the panel? Does that sound like something you're seeing in the headlines, Mr. Urban?
I mean, certainly they're finding ways to undermine various aspects of our country. In terms of my investigative efforts when I was with DEA, those investigative efforts took place outside of mainland China.
Now, obviously, this is a Homeland Security Committee, and we're talking about border security. Reading that list and just knowing a little bit about the Chinese Communist Party, do you think it's feasible that they might use fentanyl and the ingredients for deadly drugs to kill our own citizens?
Again, in terms of my investigative efforts, I did not tie it back to mainland China and the CCP there. In terms of the question itself, is it feasible?
Yeah.
I guess it is feasible.
But you would acknowledge that ingredients are coming from China, right?
Oh, I certainly, they are coming. Precursor chemicals are coming from China to Mexico.
Thank you. Ms. Maldonado, you were talking about the cartels, how effective they are, how powerful they've become, and I think we can all acknowledge that. But I want to ask you a question. Do you think that that's what initiated this surge that we're seeing on the southern border? What do you think the cause of what we're seeing on the southern border? What do you think initiated that surge that we're seeing right now is?
The surge of immigrants?
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of reasons. Actually, I was just in Juarez about 3 weeks ago on the Mexican side of the border, and I was able to talk to a lot of the migrants that were there. And I think a big part of it is they're hearing that the border is open, right? And so people are traveling. I mean, there was people there that traveled 8,000 miles with no water, no medical care, because they're hearing that the border is open. They're hearing that their family members, their friends got in, and that's what's taking them straight into the hands of the cartels. And so I think a lot of it is word of mouth. They're hearing that there's an open invitation to come into the U.S., and unfortunately, they're having to make it through incredibly difficult and horrendous circumstances to try and get here.
Yes, ma'am. Do you think something that might contribute to that is when the future president of the United States says in a 2019 Democratic primary debate, the United States is a country that tells people struggling under oppression or poor conditions, you should come, quote, you should come. They deserve to be heard. That's who we are. We are a nation that says you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come. Do you think that that's something that might initiate some of the surge that we're seeing?
I think absolutely. I think that that's what we're seeing happen. And it hasn't always been the same problem that it is now. It's a problem that's continuously increasing, and it's being orchestrated by the cartels because they're making more money than ever. But I think that a different policy it would have different results, and that's why we need to look at new avenues that haven't been thought of before.
Well, I agree. And I also think we should go back to some of the policies that were working in the past. My time is up. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. We will now enter a second round of questioning and do the same process between Republicans and Democrats for 5 minutes. I'd like to highlight the fact that I think I finally agree with one of my colleagues on the control of the border. When my colleague from New York mentioned that the cartels do in fact have control of the border, I do agree with that statement. They do have control of the border. And I'd also like to remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that Operation Fast and Furious under the Obama-Biden administration put hundreds of thousands of weapons into Mexico. And two of those weapons actually were found at the crime scene where U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was murdered. So maybe this narrative that we need to turn our Border Patrol northward to protect Mexico from U.S. weapons, maybe we should just take a deep breath and protect the United States from the illegal and illicit activities that are entering our country. I'd like to focus your attention on this chart. On the bottom rung is the year 2020, and then it goes 21, 22, and 23. These are in pounds of drugs, illicit drug seizure by weight, every single year from 2020 in red to 2021 in gray, 2022 in blue. Mr. Urban, with your 25 plus years in DEA, why do we see a doubling, tripling of the amount of drug seizures here in the United States that are coming from Mexico? I mean, is this success here, or is this actually an indicator of failed policies?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to comment on the policy aspect in terms of, it's obviously an indication of more drugs coming across the border and more seizures. That's the way I look at it. So to some degree, there is some success there if you're seizing the drugs. With the amount of drugs coming over and the amount of deaths associated with overdoses or murder for taking, pills that are laced with fentanyl, that's not success.
That's not success, I agree. So what are the policies that need to be implemented to prevent the hundreds of thousands of deaths?
It's obviously a broad question. I think the first component to that is there needs to be a joint cooperative relationship with Mexico in some way where you can action law enforcement or the military down there against the cartels. For us to disrupt the Mexican cartels, we have to start down there. That's, again, a broad issue. It's a State Department issue. It's a negotiated issue, but that's something that would have to happen to disrupt their capabilities. In terms of the Homeland, I think, again, what I talked about earlier was data, right? We need data analytics to leverage data for insight for law enforcement against the Mexican cartels and Chinese money launderers.
Yeah. You have all mentioned working with the Mexican government. Mr. Farah, do you see this administration doing anything to have accountability or relationships with the Mexican government to push back?
I think the relationship with, with Mexico as well as Colombia and many other countries is much more fraught than it was previously. I think we have fewer and fewer interlocutors that can be trusted that we can deal with. I think, as I talked about, the criminalized state structure emerging as different governments, and I think the AMLO government in Mexico is certainly moving in this direction, have become more allied on a strategic level with cartels than with the United States and other groups, as I think Colombia will do under President Petro, and as we've seen in Venezuela, and we've seen in Nicaragua, that you're facing an outlook where you have fewer levers because we have over time allowed those relationships, and I'm not saying that, I think goes back a decade at least, those relationships to deteriorate, and we have not been successful in engaging in ongoing training because the units we train and work with are consistently dismantled by when different governments come in that are more allied with the criminal groups. So you have well-trained, well-meaning people who are then dispersed to the wind. And I think that has made it more and more difficult over time to engage people who want to talk with us because they're not going to last in their own structures, and for us to have people we can talk to down there.
Thank you. Look at one of the agreements that we had from 2016, or really 2017 to 2020, and that was the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, otherwise known as Remain in Mexico. And I can't help but draw a distinction between the numbers that we're seeing here in 2020 and a policy like that does limit the amount of malign activity that a cartel can do, that they can use people. And I have been to the border a dozen times. I've seen the destruction. I've seen what Ms. Ford Maldonado has described, the assaults, the sexual assaults, the amount of money that they're charging. Ms. Ford Maldonado, what do you think about a reinstatement and an actual implementation from this administration of MPP, Remain in Mexico? Would that have an effect on the amount of drugs that we're seeing coming in this country?
I think it's possible. I think it would definitely have an effect on what's happening at the border. I think we also need to explore new avenues as to how we can secure the border and how we can stop the inhumane things that are happening. You were just saying, we've also heard stories from Border Patrol who have interviewed little girls who were raped multiple times on their journey to Mexico. Little girls that came across with the morning after pill because their parents sent them across expecting them to be assaulted on their journey. So I think something needs to be done, not just because of what's happening at the border, but what's happening beyond the border. I mean, fentanyl is affecting absolutely everyone. I think that the most recent numbers we've seen is 107,000 people that were killed in the year ending in January 2022. That's 9,000 people every 30 days. That is the equivalent of a fully loaded 747 crashing into a mountain every single day of people that are dying because of
Tragic.
this.
And thank you for your testimony. My time has expired. I recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you, Chairman. I have to, I wish that some of our colleagues were still here. On this discussion about guns illegally trafficked across the southern border to the cartels, there are solutions here, and they don't need to be partisan solutions. I wish our colleagues were here for this conversation, but, listen, I know that our colleagues across the aisle are not going to support an assault weapons ban, are not going to support a high-capacity magazine ban. I support those things. They don't. Fine, leave that conversation for another day. As Mr. Blazak has said, the issue here is firearms often being purchased legally and then trafficked to the cartels illegally. And there are things that we can do to crack down on that, like universal background checks, closing the gun show loophole so that when a gun is sold to an individual, wherever they are in whatever setting, there is a criminal background check to make sure that that firearm is not being sold to somebody with a record that suggests that they can't be trusted with it. I have introduced a bill, or I'm introducing a bill soon, to stiffen penalties for dealers that fail to conduct background checks that they are legally required to conduct. Because unfortunately, right now, under our current laws, and this is not the vast majority of gun shop owners, most of whom follow the law and do the right thing, but those that don't, when they knowingly fail to perform a background check, get a slap on the wrist over and over again. So there are things that are common sense, that ought to be bipartisan, that we ought to do, and we cannot minimize the fact that the source of the power of these TCOs, of these cartels, is their ability to inflict acts of violence on people because they are heavily armed, and that is part of the equation. I also want to build off of something that Ms. Ford said correctly when she was asked, correctly I believe, why are people coming here? And the obvious answer is, well, because they think they'll have an easy time getting across. One of the reasons that they think they have an easy time getting across is because the cartels and the traffickers are lying to them and telling them that U.S. asylum laws will let anybody come across and you have an easy time getting asylum, getting a green card, whatever the case may be. And so, again, one of the remedies to this is let people apply for asylum at U.S. consulates or from their home countries so that they can see whether they are eligible or not. And when people see themselves that they're not eligible, they'll be less likely to believe the lies that the cartels are telling them and make that dangerous, often deadly journey. So, again, there are things here that ought to be common sense, bipartisan solutions, and I do hope that's the direction.
Will the
to
gentleman
go.
yield? And I'll give you additional time.
Sure.
Is that not currently happening, where you can apply for asylum at U.S. consulates? Is that not the standard protocol?
I mean, my understanding is that the legislation that the House just passed restricts the ability of people to use the CBP-1 app to get applications to have their asylum claims considered, that the number of places in other countries where people can apply for asylum in person is limited. And again, I think under the current administration, some of those policies are changing. I think that's a positive thing. But I do think that needs to be part of the conversation. We need to make it harder for the cartels to lie to people about their eligibility.
Yeah, I think we need to check that, the specificity of that particular asylum. When you're seeking asylum and doing it in another country, I think is pretty much standard protocol that happens. And I'm not sure that the law has been changed to reflect any difference. You still have 2 minutes left, so I yield back.
All right, thank you. All right, switching gears here. We've focused most of our attention today on Mexican, Central American, South American TCOs, and rightfully so, because I think we all are in agreement that those are the TCOs that pose the most immediate risks to the homeland and to our citizens. But there are other groups out there, some of which are operating in the United States that are dangerous, and I believe Mr. Farah and others have mentioned them. ISIS, the Iranian Transnational network. can we just, and I'll open it up to any of you with my last couple minutes here. Would anyone like to spend a little more time highlighting the risks posed by some of those organizations and what we as policymakers should do to crack down on them?
Well, I think one of the real issues that we're seeing across the region is not just the traditional, like Hezbollah threat network, Iranian threat network, is the Albanian mafia is now there. There are multiple parts of the Italian mafia structures now plugging in because the cocaine market's shifting while our synthetic market here is rising. So the cocaine market in Europe and Russia, former Soviet republics, is much more lucrative than it is in the United States. And our cocaine consumption has been down while our synthetic consumption has been way up. So I think that there are numerous new types of violence being introduced, numerous new types of money laundering being introduced, numerous new types of trafficking structures are being introduced that introduce these groups that have been in this hemisphere to a whole new set of African, European, Asian, and former Soviet Republic structures that allow everyone to make a lot more money and make it much more difficult for us to crack down. There's one case I'm sure Mr. Urban's familiar with, the case of the Guyane, which is a ship that ended up being busted in Philadelphia with 17 tons. That was those are Eastern European crews loading off the coast of Chile, passing through with a different group that loaded the cocaine in the Panama Canal, then moved to Philadelphia. It was all external actors in a 17-ton cocaine shipment, which was busted almost by luck in Philadelphia. So I think that's the issue.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to weigh in on any other TCOs that we should be focused on as well as a committee? And again, ISIS, Iran.
Yeah.
Mr. Blazak is.
No, go ahead.
I'll just say on the ISIS front, I think it's particularly important that we keep our eye on Afghanistan. We've had multiple senior officials within the Biden administration speak with great alarm regarding a possible resurgence of the so-called ISIS Khorasan province in Afghanistan, so much to the point where the administration said that they worry about that group having an external operations capability within 6 months. And that statement was from a senior Department of Defense official about 3 months ago. So I think it's particularly important that we continue to invest some level of resources as it relates to tracking ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan, especially.
Thank you all.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for her questioning.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about an issue that maybe many people don't think of as connected to Homeland Security, but it's becoming more and more entwined with some of the issues that we have internationally, and it's affecting major metropolitan areas, especially a district like mine, which is Las Vegas, and that's organized retail crime. We've seen that that involves targeted, large-scale organized theft. It's run through international criminal networks. I think the Department of Homeland Security Investigations Unit issued a report saying the average American family will pay more than $500 annually in additional costs due to the impact of organized retail crime, which is being used to finance ongoing illicit operations like human trafficking and drug trafficking. There was another DHS report that noted organized retail crime is leading to more brazen, more violent attacks in retail stores throughout the country, and many of the criminal rings orchestrating these thefts are also involved in other serious activities. So I wonder, it's an incredibly complex issue, but can you make some suggestions of how we could better address it with more interaction across government agencies or with different levels of government? Anybody?
Well, I mean, the first thing you'd want to do is prioritize it and put funding into that and have a local, state, and federal response, set up a task force to do, whether it be undercover operations, to engage, they're going to sell these products after they steal them.
Right.
There's a process associated with this, and they're doing it continually again and again and again. The other component is if you could intercept their electronic communications. Obviously, if it's an international or a sophisticated organized crime group, they're communicating amongst other members. So I think that's the first thing, and I also think a deterrent, however you want to work with the private sector to have it determined at that store or at that location so it's not as easy to steal the goods.
That was going to be my question. Did you think a federal task force would be something that'd be useful? in the Department of Homeland Security?
On this specific topic, yes, I do think the more sophisticated actors that are operating beyond from state to state,
Jurisdictions.
they're doing it in multiple states. I think a federal task force would be the answer, again, encompassing state and local resources and expertise.
Well, I've got a bill, and it's bicameral, bipartisan, called Combating Organized Retail Crime, to give more resources to Homeland Security to go after this. So we should look at having a task force as part of those resources.
I've had task forces that I've supervised, and if you have proper leadership and resources, they can do amazing things. So I think the threat that you're discussing and you're talking about, that would be a solution with properly resourced up.
Thank you. Maybe we could look at that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Anybody else want to comment on that? I mean, they're stealing everything from eyelashes to power saws, you know, and reselling it, and then that money goes into other nefarious operations. Well, then let me ask you another question. This goes back to Mr. Goldman's talk about guns, that U.S. guns go to Mexico, and that's where they're used in the involvement of a lot of crime. Mr. Blazakis, could you address how we could work better with Mexico to address this issue?
So one of the most important things that we need to do with the government of Mexico is engage with them as it relates to implementing the bicentennial framework that was put in place by the Biden administration in agreement with the Mexican government. And on this front, it's still early days, but in particular, there are three pillars where I think it's particularly important to spend our time. That is in the area of jointly working on a challenge of public health related issues, which obviously is an impact that comes from the cartel work. Doing more in the area of shoring up the border, particularly in the context of using technology. I'm not a believer of building walls and moats. I think that's, you know, from times in the past, it didn't help the Chinese particularly when it comes to the creation of the Great Wall of China. It's certainly not going to work in a contemporaneous time that we live in today. There's a cyber component to this that we have to explore to pursue these criminal networks as well, and I think the bicentennial framework is an important place to do this work, but we can't alienate the Mexican government. I do think we run the risk of doing so if we consider certain other kinds of policy options, whether it's the FTO designation of the cartels, whether it's the use of authorized military force against cartel members across the border. I think these things will push AMLO into the arms of our economic adversaries like China, our ideological enemies like Iran, and our military foes like the Russian Federation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I'd like to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony, for members on this committee for your questions. And just to close with a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think you heard members on both sides of the aisle asking very similar questions. We may disagree on a couple of tactical points, but on the strategic problem that we have right now, the fact that fentanyl, the trafficking of the opioids, the problem that we see in the United States is massive, and it's tragic. And I hope that as a result of this hearing, what we will see is a push, not just in a bipartisan way, but more in a whole of government way, that we take your testimony, that we take your answers and your experience professionally, and that we're able to push this into action, because on a point of personal privilege, my 12-year-old daughter was here listening to this. I have a classmate from the Air Force Academy here with his daughter. I see many young people in the audience here today, and the reason that we're having this hearing is to preserve the next generation from being inundated with, whether it's fentanyl or other opioids, crime, or whatever else it may be. And I hope that the work on this subcommittee will really get at the heart of this, that our country can come together in a way that we can lower those numbers. And whatever the cause may be, this is not and should not be a partisan solution. It should be a bipartisan, bicameral, as Ms. Titus mentioned in her bill, solution to get after this and to see our communities safe. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we would appreciate and ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the committee rule 7 Delta, the hearing record will be open for the next 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.